So, our next guest is a human rights expert with over 20 years of experience working with advocacy and training in Europe and Africa. He is the former vice chair of the European Network Against Racism and the founder and the chair of the Pan African Movement for Justice in Sweden. He is a member of the Swedish Parliament and of the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe. He was the Assembly's General Rapporteur for combating racism and intolerance in 2020 and 2021, and is currently the Rapporteur for a report on the new Charter of European Political Parties for a Non-Racist Society. We are so honoured to welcome Mamoudou Malcolm Jallow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this very important event today.
It's great to have you here with us today. So for you, why do you think racism exists?
I think the important question should be, what is racism? Before we even can begin to understand why racism exists, we must understand what racism is. Now, racism is about power and privileges. There are certain groups in society that have accumulated so much power and privileges that it has become the norm in their lives. So, and it is said that when power and privileges become the norm, then the strive for equality begins to be perceived as a threat. And we've seen this. We've seen people see, whenever you talk about equality, when you talk about anti-racism, the privileged ones, the ones with power, would normally perceive it as a threat, and therefore they would go to whatever extent necessary to protect what they perceive to be their power and privileges. And we've seen this through different ways. It can be through exclusion, it can be through exploitation, it can be through hate crimes that we've seen, surge in Europe and other parts of the world when it comes to racism against people of African descent, when it comes to racism against Muslims, when it comes to, anti-Semitism and so on. So I think it's important to understand what it is first in order to be able to understand why it exists. Now, when we understand that it's about power and privileges, then you understand that a lot of people, if you tell them they have power and privilege, the first thing they do is not to somehow give away that power and privilege. The first thing they would do is to do whatever necessary to protect it. And that's why we see racism still happening, people being exploited and excluded and discriminated every day.
Right. So why, therefore, is it important to have a day that is specially dedicated to anti-racism?
Now, on this particular occasion, as you know, it emanated from South Africa, during the apartheid era when, over 60 people were killed by the... And this is a huge issue, and that's why the UN decided that we should have this day. But if you ask me, we should not only have one day, we should have every day, because racism does not take a break. It affects people every single day of the year. So it's important that we identify, we make sure that we bring to light and also fight against racism every single day.
Right. So what can be done specifically to address the racism that arises within the context of military conflict?
I mean, there are so many things that can be done to be able to counter racism, not only during military conflicts, but I'm glad that you mentioned military conflict, because considering what has been happening now in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the war that is going on in Ukraine has caused enormous tragedy, human tragedy, and a lot of men, women, children are running for their lives, seeking refuge. But then it's important that we mention that the right to seek refuge, the right to seek asylum applies to all. It's a universal right, regardless of the skin color, regardless of your national origin. And what we've been seeing going on during this conflict is that we are doing everything possible to help the refugees that come from Ukraine. But there is a blatant racism and discrimination going on in the borders. So there are Africans, there are Asians, there are people from the Middle East that have been students in Ukraine and have been studying there for many years. And they are also victims of the same war and tragedy. And they're trying to run for their lives. And we've seen in the borders between Ukraine and Poland that Africans and these Middle Eastern students and Asian students are being discriminated. They're not allowed to take buses or the trains that would take them to safety. They're not allowed to cross the border. When they say women and children on the buses and the trains, when Black women say, we are also women, they say, not you, we want the white woman. And we've seen this, it has somehow made it very clear that the color of your skin, your origin, your race, plays a very, very significant role. And racism plays a very significant role when it comes to who gets to come to safety, who gets to enjoy their rights to asylum, the rights to be safe and be alive. And this is terrible. And we need to be able to speak about this. Racism is bad, regardless how and where and when it occurs. But especially during conflicts when people actually are running for their lives, we should not be able to see people being prevented from getting refuge and enjoying their right to asylum like everybody else. And this conflict that we've seen in Ukraine has really revealed how deeply entrenched the racist structures and institutions are in Europe today.
Thank you. You were the General Rapporteur for the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly on combating racism and intolerance for 2 years, and you're also currently the Rapporteur for a report on a new charter for European political parties for a non-racist society. Can you please tell us about your work with the Assembly?
Yes, the Assembly plays a very important role. The Council of Europe is the world's biggest human rights organization, we would say. We are the mothers of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that, therefore, there is a huge responsibility when it comes to upholding human rights, not only in Europe, but around the world. So my role there as a member of the Council of Europe, being a General Rapporteur, the former General Rapporteur, my role basically was to make sure that I identified, bring to light, but also, try to suggest a way forward. I do that through statements. I do that through, sometimes I write directly to governments. I've done that, for example, the government of the Netherlands, where I've written directly to the government when I saw something that I thought was not in line with the European Convention on Human Rights that had to do with, for example, racial profiling against a person of African descent. So I could do this in my role as a General Rapporteur. I can make statements. I can be contacting directly the governments, contacting members of parliament, but also raising awareness on the issue, making sure that I use that platform to show that racism exists and we need to somehow address it openly. So during these 2 years that I was General Rapporteur, I've done that in so many occasions, and I used the platform that I had to be able to make visible the entrenched institutional and structural racism that we have in Europe. But not only that, but to suggest also the solutions, way forward in order to be able to address this problem.
Right. Can you also tell us about the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance and how people can get involved with that?
Yes, the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, it's a part of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. We have like-minded members of parliament who are part of the, from the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, who are part of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. And one thing we have in common is our commitment to fight against hate and racism, all forms of racism. So we gather, we have meetings, we organize hearings, we organize seminars, we write reports. I've written, for example, a report on Afrophobia, which is anti-Black racism, that was supported by the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, and it was approved and adopted in the Assembly. And now I'm writing another report on Islamophobia, and then the other one that you just mentioned earlier on, which is the Charter. The Charter is extremely important because we know representation plays a very important role in order to be able to fight racism. And when you look at the institutions in Europe, there is a huge gap when it comes to the demography of Europe and the people that represent us. So we need to work on trying to get political parties to sign on this charter and make sure that they follow some of the rules, or all the rules that we have in this charter that indicates very clearly that we should work very actively when it comes to diversity. We should make sure that representation plays a very important role. We should work hard in order to be able to work against racism and xenophobia. And this charter is extremely important. It has been there before, but now I'm working on renewing it and making it more modern so that we'll be able to push and trigger this kind of diversity that I think is required for us to be able to strengthen our democracy.
Right. So on this day, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I'm sure we have so many young people who may feel disempowered by the conflict and the discrimination and the racism that they are seeing on a daily basis. And frankly, some of them may be also facing this on a daily basis. What would you say to encourage and empower them?
I would say this: wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And it's important that young people continues to resist, because it's about young people's future. It's about our socioeconomic, political, and cultural lives, for us to be able to live a life that we can reach our potential. And anything else would not be acceptable. And I know in the capitalist atmosphere that we live in, society that we live in, we have globalized capital, but we have not globalized human rights. Now, it is up to us to do everything that we can within our powers to globalize human rights, to make sure that it applies to everybody. It is not a European value. It is not an African value. It's a universal value. And regardless how you look like, regardless what gender you have, regardless what religion you follow, it is important that the human rights applies to each and every person. And it is up to the young people to fight that fight. And for those of us that are in parliament, we would do everything possible to be allies to civil society organizations, to young people and organizations, to strengthen them and give them the power that they need to be able to fight this fight.